Okay, thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Okay, tonight we're going to be talking about the 17th century, starting with, and I want to talk a little bit about, and I know that we kind of touched on it in our last lecture, but I want to talk a little bit about Elizabeth and just kind of go over some of the things that will help you kind of put her in perspective, because even though she's dead in 1603, we think of the majority of Elizabeth's reign as being, quite honestly, a time when. Oh, you need this. Here, Rachel. I had to just put it over there. Elizabeth's reign is I think one of the most extraordinary moments in English history, and primarily I just qualify that by saying that she has vision that many leaders don't have. Elizabeth has a very far-sighted view and a very forward-thinking policy about things that are generally not so flexible in her time. The main one, of course, being religion and her religious tolerance in England. I think that's a huge piece. To me, that's the centerpiece of her domestic success, is her ability to be malleable enough with her quote-unquote Anglicanism to still make Catholics feel welcome in England and have a thriving Catholic presence, at the same time continuing to forward the Anglican Church and to put in place a system where even Jews are going to move to England in her time and begin thriving as a community of believers. So it's kind of an interesting, that piece to me is very, very good for England, and her willingness to be tolerant of different religions is way ahead of her time. The other big one, of course, is, me as a military historian, I can't get away from it, but I just want you to try to remember that she's the one that has the vision of England as a rising island power, and what being an island power really means versus being a continental power. And you start to see that contrast between England and France, with France being the true continental power of Europe for a huge part of its history, but England kind of taking a whole different perspective, and I really admire what she does, and I think that's obviously seen in American history when you study Alfred Thayer Mahan and some of the other thinkers in the Naval Academy. You know, she looked at the world and looked at the waterways, and she looked at the world just from a totally different perspective than any continental army would. She saw points of strategic value that will follow English policy well into the age of Louis XIV and much later. And this is a big reason why she was instrumental in helping the British be thinking about Gibraltar as an important strategic point, which of course they're still holding today, much to the chagrin of the Spanish. I believe it's her thought, once they saw the value of Gibraltar, they're going to see the value of being in Egypt and controlling the Suez Canal when that's finished in the mid-1800s. Certainly in Canada. The real French colony in Canada is going to be pretty much inert, because she's going to be able to give the English the vision to control Hudson Bay, to control the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is at Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and essentially be able to cut that colony off from France when need be. So when you think about Elizabeth, I think that is one of the things that I look at with her: a very, very successful domestic policy with her tolerance, and an extraordinarily far-reaching vision for British foreign policy. And I think she's really an influential figure that's going to make England such a powerful seafaring country, and ultimately the world's greatest seafaring country. We are talking today mostly about the 1600s, and of course you see that she dies in 1603. And what's left is going to be the Stuarts, and they're kind of fun to study. They're certainly a little more whimsical, and they're relatively easy. James, Charles, Charles, James. We throw Cromwell in the middle of it, and you're done. That's the long and short of it. But there are some things that are particular sticking points that we'll kind of talk about when we get to these particular kings. You can see in technology, 1608, the telescope is going to be invented. However, that's not yet Galileo's really, really good one, which he's going to get in 1609, and he's going to be able to improve the telescope to a point where I forget what his power was, but it was about 8 or 10 power telescope, and Galileo is going to be actually the first person to see the stars under magnification and start him down the path of really kind of walking that line between being a complete heretic and look at the world and say, well, you know, Copernicus was probably on base when he did what he did, and it was his finding of Copernican work that really got him in trouble. You see 1610 is publication of Starry Messenger, and in Starry Messenger, remember that Galileo wrote about the controversial part of Starry Messenger is really his letters to Christina of Tuscany, because Christina of Tuscany is Christina de Medici, which obviously means that she's going to be very, very closely tied to the church, and he's going to be very honest with her because she's her patron, or he is her patron. And he told her, he said, I'm making the most extraordinary discoveries with this telescope. It's bringing me a lot of income, because if you remember the story, he sold it to the merchants of Venice, and he kept a nice, tidy little regular income from that. And then he kept one for himself, and he's looking at the moon, and he's looking at other things. He blinded himself by looking at the sun. And the advancements he was making, he felt he had a responsibility to talk to his patron to say, hey, I appreciate you giving me money. Here's what I'm doing with your money. The problem is he was just a little bit too honest with it. And he really got himself in a lot of trouble because he's writing to a person who's closely tied to the papacy, because she's the direct descendant of Leo X from the first late pope we talked about in our last meeting. And so that's what's going to get him in a whole big problem. And that's all happening in front of what you see on your timeline in 1618. As you can see, it's hard for me to talk about timelines because I still want to get thematic on you. So it's difficult for me to go from Elizabeth to Galileo in Italy, and now here we go into the 30 Years' War. 1618 obviously is a very important year in European history because that's going to be the great conflagration of the 30 Years' War. Remember that it did start in Prague, and that the Bohemians were very much in protest of having their culture Germanified by the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand I, and they did not appreciate the fact that not only was Czech language to be downplayed, but that all the schools and all public happenings would be done in German. And that caused a great deal of upset, and that was encapsulated in the idea that the emperors, not the emperor, but the 4 electors, I believe it was 4 electors, came to Prague to kind of give the fathers of Prague the bad news, the town council, and of course they proceeded to toss him out of a window and make a big joke about it. And that was what Ferdinand was looking for, was an excuse then to hire the 2 mercenary armies, that of Albrecht of Wallenstein out of Bohemia, and then the Spanish conquistadores to come into Bohemia and begin what will be an absolutely horrible first phase of the 30 Years' War, culminated by the Battle of White Mountain in 1620. And really after 1620, at least in Bohemia and in Eastern Europe, there's not a whole lot of activity that we go further and talk about, because they pretty much wiped out the Protestant stronghold on White Mountain, and that was pretty much put all the Protestants on the run from 1620 to 1625. You also see the name of Albrecht von Wallenstein, and he's Wallenstein, seen both. An extraordinary individual in the 30 Years' War, who was the finest military commander of the 30 Years' War. Not such a nice guy, and if you recall the story of Wallenstein and what he did to the citizens of Milano to raise funds for his mercenary army was extraordinarily poorly behaved. They were rapists and murderers of the highest order, and Wallenstein, he tended to look the other way, rarely participated in any kind of the thuggery and pillage that his men lived off of, but that's what mercenaries lived off of at this time. So when Richelieu finally decided to allow this murderous army to transport itself along the French-Swiss border, carefully escorted by the newly founded French army, the National French Army. Wallenstein, will go into with the land today, which we call the Low Countries of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands, and then ultimately fight his way, rape and pillage his way up into Denmark, where things really, really turn nasty. And this second phase of the 30 Years' War runs from 1625 to 1629, and it's one of the worst particular moments in European history, because the Danish king tried as best he could to call Wallenstein's army off, and he began pleading with Ferdinand I, who of course orchestrated this whole thing and was writing the checks for these mercenary armies. And Ferdinand pleaded back to Wallenstein to cease and desist his activities in Denmark, and Wallenstein said no. I'm not going to call off my men, because this is what they were trained to do, and this is what they wanted, and this is what you hired us to do, and we're going to finish the job. So the Danes continue to suffer horribly, the Dutch continue to suffer horribly, and that brought us up to that moment when, and I'm going down to, because I'm staying with the war, but if you look down to 1629, you see the Edict of Restitution. This is the moment where you kind of have to now go back, and I cautioned you in our last lecture to try your best to remember the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. Because what happens is, whenever you talk about the 30 Years' War, you keep referring back to the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. So if you can keep that as a framework, you can understand the 30 Years' War pretty well. If you don't, then you're going, oh, geez. What was that all about? The Peace of Augsburg of 1555, remember, is the first document of religious toleration for Europe. It allowed all princes within the Holy Roman Empire to choose if they would prefer to be Catholic or Lutheran. Okay, I'm not saying Protestant, right? Just Catholic or Lutheran were the choices. That peace will be essentially torn up in 1629. That's the easiest way to remember this. Okay, the Peace of Augsburg stopped the fighting between Catholics and Protestants because of Luther's 95 Theses. The fighting stops in 1555. You have relative peace in the HRE from 1555 until the 30 Years' War. Now, yes, there were the Hussite Wars, there were some things that happened, but relative peace between Protestants and Catholics. Then the 30 Years' War starts. It becomes a mercenary fest, and it's really, really, really bad, especially for Protestants in the Holy Roman Empire. By 1629, the light of the Reformation is out. It is gone. There is officially no more Protestant faith in the Holy Roman Empire with the Edict of Restitution, because the Edict of Restitution says, and this is part you don't write down, maybe you did in class, but you don't try to remember it, because all it does, it tears up Augsburg. It says all lands secularized since 1553 go back to the Catholic Church. 1553 is a very safe date. It's well prior to 1555. All lands secularized, which means all lands that went from Catholic to Protestant now go back to Catholic. Done. Edict of Restitution, 1629. So we always use that as a stopping point in the 30 Years' War and kind of go, wow, you know what, if you're a Protestant and you're in the Holy Roman Empire and it's 1629, you're on the run. You're either on the run or you are converting and getting your tithes ready and getting your 10% ready from your income and getting back into the Catholic Church. And it probably wasn't an easy thing for a lot of them to do. And then, of course, 1630 comes the Savior. 1630 is the entrance of the most unlikely, most obscure moment in modern European history, when it is the ragtag, I shouldn't say ragtag, they were not. They were very, very professional, highly trained, and very disciplined. They're just so small. The Swedish army, led by King Gustavus Adolphus, is going to cross the Baltic and land in what we believe to be the area probably around Danzig and or Gdansk today, and in central Poland. And their army is going to come ashore with about 40,000 men and mobile artillery. Small, very, very small caliber cannonade that can be used very, very differently than explosives were ever used in the 30 Years' War. Everything else was all used as siege cannon and howitzers for reduction of fortifications. The Swedes were the first to actually consider using ordnance on a battlefield. and they're going to be extraordinary. And of course, some of you may be aware that the size of their army doubled when they got into, was able to not only turn the tide of the 30 Years' War back over to the Protestants, but also convinced probably the most hardcore mercenary in Albrecht of Wallenstein that there is something more worth fighting for than just money. And Wallenstein, you know, is going to have a moment of opportunity to meet the great king of Sweden, and he does so, and he leaves a changed man. And he decides there are some things worth fighting for, and that he's been fighting on the wrong side of the war. Of course, when he told his men that was his undoing. His men were not going to hear that, and that ends up being the sad story there. So Wallenstein is seen by some in European history as kind of their Benedict Arnold, because he did change sides in the war. Not to be confused with Napoleon III much later in history, but he did change sides as well. So the situation is now in the 30 Years' War that it has kind of changed, and the Swedes are, even though they lose their great commander, they continue on the offensive, and then we have something incredible happen by 1635 in the 30 Years' War, and that is that the Swedes, and we'll never say this again, I don't know if we'll ever say it, I don't like you saying never ever statements, but the Swedish army is on the Danube River. Swedes on the Danube, what does it really mean? You understand that Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, is also on the Vienna, and a lot of other great cities are, on the Danube, and many, many great cities are on the Danube. So what this translates to is something it's pretty extraordinary, in that they're going to get an edict. The Peace of Prague will be settled, and that Peace of Prague in 1635, okay, we ready? Here we go. Back to Augsburg again. All lands secularized since 1553 are now resecularized. Or, it's easier to remember, they're going to get the Scotch tape out and they're going to tape the Peace of Augsburg back together. So Augsburg is back together. You understand Augsburg. Augsburg is torn up in 1629. Augsburg is put back together in 1635. And I'd like to say we should stop the 30 Years' War right there, because it's come full circle. We're really done. But of course we're not, because this is the part of the 30 Years' War that's muddled, that's confusing, that's convoluted, because now Richelieu and the French are going to get involved. And so our minds immediately shift to, oh yeah, that's right, it's going to be the fourth phase, the French phase, 1635 to 1648, Peace of Westphalia. We're going to redraw the map of Europe, blah-de-blah-de-blah. Blah. And of course, this is going to be swung back to the Catholics now, right? Because France is a Catholic country, and Richelieu is a cardinal in the Catholic Church. No. Richelieu's going to join the Protestants. And it defies everything you've learned about this war, and you go, wait a minute, what? Why would Catholic France side with the Protestants in a religious war? It makes absolutely no sense, except we now have to think about modern war. We have to think about what Richelieu is really all about. Because you shouldn't stay puzzled for too long. If you understand Cardinal Richelieu of France, you should understand the man is a modern politician. I think Bismarck is cut from the same cloth. Remember that Richelieu's goal for France is to do what? It was a very simple goal. His domestic policy goal for France is to make the King of France supreme in France. And that's why he's going to establish a postal system, and he's going to try to bring down, remember, he's going to carve into their document, L'Edit de Nantes, the Edict of Nantes, hello, okay, L'Edit de Nantes, and he's going to take out that important second piece of it that says that the Huguenots can fortify their towns and castles. He's going to say, we don't want you to do that. You can still have your religious freedom, but we really want your guns. We want your gunpowder. And it's not because we're going to use it against you. It's because we're going to invite you Huguenots with Catholics into our modern French army. A true national army for France. It's going to be the largest army in Europe, and it's going to be completely the idea of Richelieu, along with his Minister of War, Louvois, and his Minister of Discipline, Martinet, and they're going to come up with this idea, they're going to hatch this idea that modern France has to have one army to protect everyone, to protect the country. And it's a bold, bold thing. And that's why Richelieu is going to issue, or he's going to issue what he called, if you remember the document called the Peace of Alais, also called the Edict of Alais, A-L-A-I-S. That document is the same year as the Edict of Restitution of 1629. So you see what Richelieu does is very, very clever. He nationalizes the French army. He brings more power under his king, who quite honestly is not really a very powerful king, but it's Louis XIII, who he pretty much controls anyway. So it's really under him. And then he waits. And he bides his time like a smart, modern, realpolitik. And with all the Machiavellian talents that he has, he waits until the time is right to do what? To join the winning side in the 30 Years' War, and for the next 13 years, ravage as much of the Habsburg wealth as he possibly can, because this is all about politics. This is no longer a religious war. This is a brilliant politician who looks like a cardinal and has the flowing robes and is impressive as all get out. But really, he's a politician first. And his foreign policy goal is to make France supreme. So he's a relatively simple guy because we study him from history. We wouldn't be able to figure this cat out at all if we were living in the 1600s. But he wants to make the king supreme in his own country, which is really means him. And then he's going to make France #1 in the world. And the only way you become #1 is when you take down #1. And that's going to be the Holy Roman Empire. So there's a method to it, and it makes sense. But you see the incredible transition of the 30 Years' War from this relatively straightforward, mercenary involved, religious conflict into really, some people call this a world war, like a modern political world war, because it's being fought for political gain and not necessarily at all for religious hegemony at all. So the Peace of Westphalia, which ends this thing in 1648, is also, it took over 10 years to negotiate. Richelieu died in 1642. Louis XIII died in 1643 or 44. So these guys are already dead. And they're still in the 30 Years' War. Because we know the King of France at the end of the 30 Years' War is little Louis XIV. And he's a child. So 1648 in Westphalia is a culmination of really a political objective and not settling a religious conflict in Europe at all. Okay, I realize that was a lot longer than you probably ever wanted on the 30 Years' War, but I can go off the rails when I'm talking about this stuff. Okay, let's shift to England and talk a little bit. So you can see 1625 to 1649 is Charles I. I don't see Jimmy in there, but James I is going to be with the end of Elizabeth. Remember, he's the first Stuart monarch, 1603 to 1625. And the reason I only throw James I in there is because he deserves to be in there, because the authorized version of the Bible is really his greatest contribution. Now, he wrote 2 books, True Law, Free Monarchy, and what else did he write? He wrote a book on, he didn't write it, of course. He had somebody else do it, but his name is on it. Divine Right of Kings. Those are his 2 books, and he wrote those 2, and he also sent the scholars back to the Holy Land to kind of get a better translation of the Bible and not go through a Latin wash. So they don't use the Vulgate like the old Wycliffe Bible from the 1300s. They go back to the original Hebrew to English, Aramaic to English, and then Greek to English to get the King James Bible. That's really his lasting legacy. He dies in 1625. Yes, it's true that James I didn't play well with others. He didn't get along with Parliament. But nothing like his son Charles I. Charles I is considered the ogre, but also a friend of the common man because of his price controls and things like that. So let's talk about Charles Stuart. Okay, Charles I, 1625. Charles Stuart is, or Charles I as we know him, somewhat controversial because let's talk about the good things that he did. Charles I was considered a very wise and good king because the peasants loved him. Why the peasants like him? Because he put price controls on the things that peasants really need, like sugar and basic flour, and yes, beer and ale, and these kind of stuff for this what we call the basics of life. The prices were held low so that merchants were not allowed to in times of shortages and things like that to basically raise prices so that peasants would have a harder time getting those products. So he was loved by the common man, and he'll be relatively popular, and I say relatively popular amongst the landed gentry and the officers in his military, because they're going to become the Cavaliers when the Civil War gets going. Charles I is intensely disliked by Protestants, and that's partly because he was somewhat of a, I don't like the word zealot. I mean, he was an aggressive Catholic king, and he wanted to re-Catholicize England, and he wanted to do it forcefully by establishing a group through his Archbishop, our Bishop William Laud, which was the Court of the Star Chamber, which took pretty much all of its lessons from the Spanish Inquisition and secured confession through torture, using various methods that are considered today to be way beyond waterboarding and things like that. They were using all kinds of physical torture to get people to secure confession of not being true Catholics. This also happens to coincide with the Puritan migration to Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts, which is not a great surprise. And it's always kind of an understated thing when you study American history that, oh yeah, you know, the people that came to Plymouth Colony, they were escaping religious persecution, like maybe it was a little bit of a hassle. Not really. It was a little bit worse than that. The Court of the Star Chamber was not friendly to, especially to Puritans, who were the most easily picked out of all the Protestants, because their hair was as short as mine, and they tended to wear plain black clothing, and they never said a foul word in public, and they wouldn't drink any alcohol, and they would never go out on Sundays. They're pretty easy to pick out. You know, those people who are wearing the belt buckles on their helmets, and yeah, those guys. You know, let's go beat up some Puritans, you know, something like that. So. Charles was very unpopular in that regard, but Charles also, if you remember, he signed instruments to Parliament, and then he would turn around and dismiss Parliament. The most famous one being his Petition of Right, and that was in the 1620s. Probably have another 1628 is probably the actual date. I don't have it on there, but Charles signed Petition of Right, and then dismissed Parliament. Parliament was kind of like, darn it. We didn't think about that. We didn't think the king could dismiss us. They didn't put that into the document. They did put restrictions on the king and how he could raise taxes and where he could quarter soldiers and things like that, but they forgot to put a clause in there to say that the king can't just sign the thing and get rid of us. So he needed Parliament to levy taxes, and he didn't need Parliament for a period of English history called the Time of Long Parliament, and that's when Pride's Purge and these other guys are going to go through England. And it's unfortunate that this period really occurred, because obviously there's going to be a complete breakdown between the legislators and the king, and that will continue to erode. And then the king will finally call Parliament back, and that's when we're going to throw the Triennial Act at him. And that was, of course, that Parliament has to meet at least once every 3 years. The king cannot quarter any troops in someone's home, and abolishing the Court of the Star Chamber, and Archbishop Laud was executed. Yes?
Is this the Rump Parliament too?
Yes, that was Pride's Purge. It resulted in the Rump Parliament. And they were there, I think there were supposed to be, 500 members, and I think there's like 42 of them. And they continue to meet in spite of the fact that the king has abolished them. So they don't have a consensus. They can't make any laws. There's not enough for a consensus. But by gosh, we're going to continue to meet. And by gosh, we're going to continue to give speeches. And of course, one of the outspoken ones, of course, is Cromwell. And that's where he's going to kind of, come on the scene and not always be so beloved. But this is really about the rise of Cromwell. And then once Charles signs Triennial Act, then he turns around and dismisses Parliament again, and he can't, because he doesn't have the authority to do that. That puts the king in direct violation of Magna Carta, which is what Mr. Jordan began talking about. When you start at 1215 in English history, as far as I know, the only thing going on in 1215 in England is going to be Magna Carta and King John. And that's such a huge, huge piece, because what that document did, and why that king ever signed that document, talk about not reading the fine print or having a good lawyer pore over it, or what our politicians do today, right? We have to pass the law before we read it, or something ridiculous like that. The king is accountable. And when the king is held accountable to the law, in other words, the law applies equally to all people, including the king. Once the king breaks the law by breaking Trinio Act, you just dust off Magna Carta and say you're in violation of your own law. And that's the beginning of what will be the English Civil War from 1642 to 1649, because when the king violates the law, there has to be some kind of repercussion. The concept is really bold, but it sticks. It means a lot. No man is above the law. And he felt that he was. And so that leads us to the English Civil War. And 7 years of English Civil War end, of course, with the Cavaliers and the Roundhead, which sounds like a really bad NBA game. And, of course...
Was that called the War of Roses?
No, remember, the War of Roses comes after the 100 Years' War, after 1453. Comes the War of Roses, and that's the rise of the Tudor family through, I believe, the Lancaster. It was York and Lancaster, and I think that the Tudor family were cousins of the Lancaster.
Okay.
So, yeah, just another English bloody civil war. That's one thing you can't have happen when you're in a school in England. You're going to say, hey, you guys going to study Civil War in here? Which one? That's their legacy. Okay, so we end in 1649 with the arrest, trial, and execution of Charles I. And that was kind of a big deal because that's, well, once you kind of cut off the king's head, you can't go back. You know, it's like the French Revolution. It's like, well, you may not like the guy, but, well, now you really don't have an alternative. Okay, so what are you going to do? So Cromwell and the House of Commons are going to take over, literally, and Cromwell is going to establish the time called the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth of England is supposed to be a time in English history when essentially they had a more open society because it was led by the legislature, but we know the exact opposite was true. Cromwell, as Lord Protector, was really more dictator, and that was a time when Catholics started to leave there because they saw the handwriting on the wall that now you begin Puritan persecution. And that was when, of course, no whoring or fighting, no alcohol, no swearing on the streets. You can't even be out on a Sunday unless you're going to and from church. And this was all like this time of very, very austere Puritan imposition of law. Wow, what a surprise. Yeah, when you study the history of Maryland, you start looking at the Commonwealth of Maryland and realize, wow, Maryland is mostly Catholic. And it was settled about the time of Cromwell. So a lot of American history overlaps with this stuff. You know that a good deal of colonial American history, all of a sudden these little gears start really sliding into place very nicely when you look at all the colonies of our original 13 colonies and how this history kind of played out. So it's a tough time in England because they thought they were getting something different, and they really weren't getting anything different. They were getting something even more austere. And if you think it was bad in England, it was much, much, much worse in Ireland because Cromwell's persecution of the Irish is quite legendary. And aside from you know, I tease Anna a lot, but I can tell you that this is probably the worst time in modern Irish history. Is the treatment that Cromwell is going to dish out on the Irish is by any reasonable yardstick criminal in the persecution and the executions and the kinds of horrific things that are done to the Irish people at the hands of Cromwell and his new model army, which was, you know, a highly effective army. There was also significant opposition from the Dutch at this time, and they're at least worthy of mention in the 1600s because the Dutch are going to be big players in later exploration and, of course, finding Manhattan and the part of New York City. But the Dutch are going to have a lot of people who defected from Cromwell. Not all of them were Catholic either, but a lot of really good admirals from the English Navy went over to the Dutch Navy and did everything they could to cause problems for the English at that time. So I would say that England became extraordinarily unpopular during the time of Cromwell's leave as Lord Protector. When he died, his son took over for about 4 months, and his son decided he didn't want to do it. They didn't know what to do. So Parliament came back, and that's when they decided to pursue their restoration. And the restoration is from 1660 to 1685, and that's the restoration of Charles II. Charles II was the son of Charles I. Charles II had spent most of his adult, well, all of his formative years and into his adult life in Paris. And Charles II is the antithesis of Cromwell, completely. Although he's not extraordinarily zealot as a Catholic, like his father. He is, I say, the opposite of Cromwell, because this is when they're going to return to, as they said, fun. He's the merry monarch. This is a guy who's going to come back to England, and he's going to bring really French, Parisian attitudes into London. And so everything is going to be opened up. You know, the ale and the beer is going to flow, the ale is going to flow, prostitution is going to soar, gambling is back, and all of the vices that are the very worst part of like London and the seedier parts of London, it's all coming back. So it's almost like, you know, the pendulum is swinging all the way back in the other direction. But from 1660 to 1685, Charles II is going to lead England and is, for the most part, extraordinarily popular, except that's going to be the second Puritan wave of migrations. They're going to get out. The Puritans are going to not want any part of this activity in England, so the Puritans are going to head out to Virginia and make a second Puritan colony in the United States. So that brings us, after that restoration, we finally get to the end of the life of Charles II, who, by the way, is the younger brother of James II. And so immediately the wheels start turning. You're like, wait a minute, when they restored the monarchy, why did they pass up the older brother? Why did Parliament go to the little brother, who is, let's be honest, he's a dirty little boy, he had STDs, he had this Parisian lifestyle. Why did they pick him over the more logical choice, which would be Charles I, eldest son, which is going to be James II? Any ideas? Yeah, and he was what else? Son of Charles I.
Was he Catholic?
Very. Charles II, you know, he's kind of like, yeah, I am, but he was more of a submarine Catholic, right? Surfaced only on Christmas and Easter. And James II was Mass every day, Eucharist every day, you know, really by the book. So by the time Charles II died, and some say he died of, STDs. By the time Charles II died, dirty little boy that he was, his older brother's pretty old. And so Parliament kind of looked at it and said, you know, we can handle a couple years of a papist because he's not going to be that much of a threat, and he's probably going to die, and we've got, you know, there's more Stuart family that can, by that time, they'll be of age, and we'll be okay. Until James II went and did what? Yeah, he went and married a young hottie, like 18 or 19 years old, and he's like 60-something, and they had a baby. What was it, a boy or a girl? It's a boy. It was a boy, and the boys, well, think about it. Think about Parliament's doing. Parliament's doing a little freak out because Parliament's going, wait a minute. Now we got a problem because now you got an heir to the throne who's a male, and he's baptized Catholic, and they kind of do the big, oh, geez. And then somebody, there's got to be some lawyer out there, you know, and some lawyer digs up. Wait a minute. 1673, Charles II signed the Test Act. And what did the Test Act say? Only an Anglican can attend university or hold office. Well, why would Charles II sign that? He didn't care. They weren't threatened by him. But now they've got Test Act, and they say, wait a minute, Test Act, you're not a valid king. And so this blows up in Parliament, and they have a huge issue over it. And this is when you get Bonnie Prince Charlie, and you get the Great Pretender, and you get all these people vying for the throne. There's mass confusion in England, and the Glorious Revolution. 1688, they decide we're going to settle this thing once and for all. We're going to offer the throne to the eldest daughter of James II. And that, of course, is a little bit of a problem because it's a daughter, but that's from the first marriage because he was a widower, didn't divorce, he was a widower. But that's going to be Mary of William and Mary. And then England becomes the limited constitutional monarchy because the only way they'll accept William and Mary, and that's William of Orange III, not William of Orange we talked about last time, who is the contemporary of Elizabeth, running the guns and getting the guns and fighting the Spanish and the whole thing with the Armada and Protestant wins. Different William of Orange, but same family. This is William of Orange III. He's married to Mary Stuart, and you know them as William and Mary. which is why there's a Williamsburg, Virginia, and why England is able to do something extraordinary, because in 1688, England becomes a limited constitutional monarchy where the king is no longer at the top of the food chain. Parliament is now at the top, and the king has to basically adhere to Parliament's whims. Yes?
This says William II.
He's William II of Orange, yes. Because William I was William the Conqueror. So he's probably William II, but it's William and Mary.
I thought it was William. I thought you said William III.
He's William, I'm sorry, William III is of Orange. He's called William of Orange III. Okay? Is there a misprint on there? What year is it?
No, keep going.
Yeah, okay, so all you remember is there's two William of Orange. And the first one is called William the Silent. And he's the guy who led the Protestant revolt against Spain and the Duke of Alva and all that stuff, again, post-1555. And that was Philip II and the whole thing with the Spanish Armada.
So William III of Orange becomes William II of England?
Yes.
Was William the Silent one who didn't really speak English, or like, what's the name?
I don't know if he didn't speak. You're talking about William of Orange III? Did he not speak English? We have 10 minutes to do so, okay? Okay, so the last part of the 1600s, I always put it in two pieces. Part of it is because I'm a Russian military historian, so I want to talk briefly about Peter the Great, okay? Because we have to put him in there. But we really have to put Louis XIV in there, okay? Louis XIV is the longest ruling king in French history. So famous that there's actually going to be 18 of them, but when they say the word Louis, it's only one person, that guy. The man who built Versailles because he was afraid of Paris. And he had good reason to, because he was the witness of a revolution when he was a young boy at age 5, and the fighting got very, very close to him, and he never trusted Paris, and that's probably a smart thing. He didn't trust Paris. He went to his father's hunting lodge out at Versailles and fell in love with it and decided to build the biggest royal palace in European history. And no one knows what it cost because he threw away all the receipts. He didn't want anybody to know. But please, I implore you, do not get sucked into the trap that all the kids that have had coach cleats or in the state of South Carolina right now always think about. The cost at Versailles is so astronomical that that's what emptied the French treasury and cost the French Revolution. Remember, it's 1% of the French budget. It's not that big a deal. Louis XIV, his great flaw is not his excess for parties or for lavish palaces. His great flaw, of course, is his love of war. And he said that on his deathbed. Louis XIV is going to get France involved in 4 wars, and they're going to be so extraordinarily costly. for extraordinary little gain. 3 stalemates and then the War of Spanish Succession, which we'll talk about when we get in our next lecture in the 1700s. But even he said he loved war too much. He absolutely bankrupted the French fighting in these wars for national glory and for his natural boundaries, which he felt they should control the headwaters of the Rhine. They had the Pyrenees, they had the Alps, and they had the Atlantic, and he had this grand notion, of course, that Napoleon's going to be able to do very easily, but he had this grand notion, and of course, there are the English, the people that are pursuant to the idea of the balance of power. And by the way, just to throw a little bit more craziness into your layers here, the most open adversary to Louis XIV for the entire time is that same William of Orange III. That same guy who will become King William of England, without a doubt, is the most open adversary to Louis XIV the entire time of Louis's reign. The entire time when Louis is trying to gain, we talk about the War of Devolution, we talk about the War of League of Augsburg, we talk about all these things. Who's always putting there the coalition to fight the French? It's always William of Orange III. He's always doing it. Because he has the most to lose. Where are the French going to go? They're not going to go across the Alps. They're not going into Switzerland. They're not going to go up the big hill. They're not going to go across the Pyrenees. They're going toward the Netherlands. They're going into the Low Countries. So they have the most to lose. And you end up with famous figures like Marlborough, who's John Churchill, who's going to be a name we'll know about later in the 20th century, and Prince Eugene of Savoy, and William of Orange III, and these guys. And this is what really hurts the French. And it's interesting today that the French will finally admit that with all the grandeur and all the cool stuff with l'état c'est moi, I am the state, really, they finally admit that Louis XIV is what really put them on the rails to the French Revolution. That they're never going to recover from this. Okay. Anything else jumping out here? I'm going to talk about Peter just for a second, then we're going to be done. We can talk about 1683 and the Turkish invasion. The last real Turkish threat is in 1683. That's the year the Turks lay siege to Vienna. And does anybody remember who came to the rescue of the Habsburgs? Bam, Prince Eugene of Savoy. No, well, actually, no. It was not Prince Eugene of Savoy. I apologize. I heard Prince, and I'm like, yes. It was Prince Jan Sobieski of Poland. Yeah, the Poles. The Poles.
Oh yeah, I remember the Poles because they were like the least likely to be helpful to them, but they still came in.
And they still did, because Poland is very, very Catholic, and they felt it was their obligation to send their great winged hussars south, and they drove the Turks out of Vienna and saved Vienna. And for that, what will the Habsburgs do to Poland? Within 50 years, it'll be partitioned. Yeah, you think they'd be nice? Poland never gets treated nicely. No, they don't. Okay, in a nutshell, Peter the Great is one of those leaders that the Russians still call him Peter the Great. I mean, he's not like Catherine. They do not like Catherine. They do not call her the Great, but they do revere Peter very much, because it was Peter the Great who had the singular vision and the energy to transform Russia from the most backward country in Europe into a major player in the balance of power. And a big part of that is because Peter is the only Russian that ever actually traveled to the West. And he went to the West. They say he went incognito, but the guy's 6'6". I don't know how somebody's going to travel incognito when you speak Russian and you're 6'6". But he did take a job as a carpenter's mate in Amsterdam, and he learned carpentry, and he loved shipbuilding, and he was totally mesmerized by Amsterdam, and that's why he's going to go back and build his city on a swamp, St. Petersburg, move the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and of course, raise the ire of the old believers as the Antichrist, as they saw him, stripping Moscow of its third Rome and everything else, and all the foreboding of the Book of Revelation is going to come down on the Russian people, and instead they end up with extraordinary ballet and a beautiful city that is European and does not look Russian at all, but at the expense of over 100,000 peasants. We don't know because the Russians don't count, but at least 100,000 peasants who died draining the swamps and making St. Petersburg into this beautiful window to the west that Peter's so extraordinarily proud of. Of course, it's frozen half the year, but it sure is pretty in the summer anyway. So I don't recommend going in the winter, but it's really pretty in the summer. So his legacy is Russia's going to have a modern navy. That takes time. By the way, one of the guys he's going to hire is, well, they'll hire him later in history, but one of the more famous Americans, guy was made his name in Lake Erie, a guy named John Paul Jones, very famous in American history, served as an admiral in the Russian Navy. And not many people know about that. The Russians are going to always be playing catch up, and what they're going to do is Peter's going to get the checkbook out, and he's going to purchase, whatever they need. We need a better military. We're getting beaten by Charles XII and the Swedes. Oh, we'll fix that. We'll hire French military advisors. They were very good at the time, not like 1940. They're very, very good. They came in, completely reformed the Russian army. He builds a Russian navy. He builds a seaport. He establishes that men have to shave their beards. He brings in ballet, classical music, and he just kind of drives this thing. He just keeps driving it. And that's what's always embodied in his the famous Bronze Rider, where Peter's up riding this horse, and it's a symbol of Russia. The horse is reared up and fighting its master, and he's on the reins, and he's pulling it in. And of course, the horse is going to come down and trample what? The snake, which is what? Symbol of the snake. The Swedes. The devil. The Swedes, because the Swedes were the Baltic power at that time. And of course, the Swedes, they're headed into the sunset now of European history, and the Russians are going to become, a major power broker. And Peter's gone. The city's actually started in 1715, and Peter's dead in 1725. So he only had about 10 years of happiness in his new city. So
That was the sculpture that they buried, right?
that was, yeah. So the Nazis couldn't shell it.
Charles VII was a person of Sweden who fought against Peter the Great, right?
Correct. I thought it was Charles the 12th.
Oh, fuck yeah. Fine.
Okay. I'm not going to argue numerology because I'm not a math guy, but I think Charles the 12th. Yeah, and he is the antithesis of Gustavus Adolphus. He was arrogant, and he underestimated the Russians because he beat them badly at Narva, and he got to Poltava. And just more Russians. They're just dumb. They don't know what they're doing. And he thought he'd just go in there and clean them up. And next thing you know, the Russians are using their weapons correctly. They're interlocking fields of fire. Next thing you know, the Swedes are routed, and that's Peter's greatest victory, because that drives the Swedes out of mainland Europe. So that was a big moment for the Russians. Kind of bad for the Swedes. So Charles XII is the guy. I could go on all night, but I'm not going to. I'll keep it to an hour.